The courtroom at Providence Federal Court fell into heavy silence when 4 photographs were placed on easels facing the jury. 4 men, all Mexican immigrants, all dead from a kitchen fire. Diego Ramirez, 24. Miguel Santos, 28. Carlos Hernandez, 31. Luis Gutierrez, 35. They'd all worked at Casa Mendoza, a Mexican restaurant in Providence. They'd all burned to death on March 15, 2024, trapped in a kitchen with locked fire exits. In the front row sat Francisco Gutierrez, 52, Luis's older brother. He wore a simple button-down shirt from Walmart and held a rosary with trembling hands. Francisco had worked for the same restaurant chain 2 years earlier before escaping. He knew exactly what had killed his brother. Not the fire, the locked doors, the slavery, the greed. Beside him sat 17 other former workers who'd escaped from various Casa Mendoza locations. Some still had scars from beatings. Others had nightmares about the windowless basement rooms where they'd been imprisoned. All had been promised $15 per hour in work permits. All had received $3 per day and threats against their families if they tried to leave. Across the courtroom sat Ricardo Mendoza, 55, originally from Guanajuato, Mexico, worth an estimated $180 million. He owned 47 Mexican restaurants across the eastern United States, Casa Mendoza, a chain promising authentic Mexican cuisine. He wore an Armani suit worth $8,900, a gold Rolex presidential worth $85,000, and Italian leather shoes at $2,400. His manicured hands, his perfectly styled hair, his dismissive smirk. Everything about him screamed wealth built on the backs of people he considered disposable. Behind him sat 11 attorneys from Martinez and Associates, specialists in defending employers accused of labor violations. Their lead counsel, Eduardo Martinez, commanded $4,500 per hour and had a reputation for making enslaved workers look like criminals who got what they deserved. But they were about to face Judge Caprio, specially assigned to this federal case due to its severity and the international human trafficking implications. Before we dive into what happened in that courtroom, if you believe in justice and want to support a new channel dedicated to sharing these powerful stories, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Every subscription helps us bring more of Judge Caprio's wisdom to light. Judge Caprio entered, and everyone rose. At 79, with 37 years on the bench, he'd presided over human trafficking cases before. But the case file before him, case 24 FD 8156, had made him physically ill. 4 men burned alive, locked in, enslaved, all preventable. This court is now in session, he said quietly, his eyes moving from the death photographs to Mendoza. Case number 2024 FD 8156. The United States versus Ricardo Mendoza. Mr. Mendoza is charged with 4 counts of second-degree murder, human trafficking, forced labor, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to violate federal immigration laws. Eduardo Martinez stood immediately. Your Honor, my client, Ricardo Mendoza, is a successful restaurateur who built a Mexican food empire from nothing. He came to this country with empty pockets and through hard work created 47 restaurants, employing over 2,000 people. This prosecution is an attempt to criminalize immigration assistance and normal restaurant employment practices. What happened on March 15th was a tragic accident, a kitchen fire. The workers who died were undocumented immigrants who came to the United States illegally. My client provided them employment when no one else would. He cannot be held criminally responsible for their immigration status or for a building code violation that was the landlord's responsibility. Judge Caprio's jaw tightened. Mr. Martinez, 4 men burned to death in a locked kitchen. The prosecution alleges they were enslaved. That's not immigration assistance. The prosecution will make inflammatory allegations, Your Honor. We will prove that Mr. Mendoza operated legitimate restaurants and that these workers were fairly compensated according to the agreements they made. We'll see, Caprio said coldly. Ms. Thompson, present the government's case. Federal prosecutor Jennifer Thompson stood, her expression grim. Your Honor, Ricardo Mendoza didn't build a restaurant empire. He built a slavery operation disguised as a restaurant chain. For 8 years, he trafficked undocumented workers from Mexico with false promises of legal employment, then imprisoned them, starved them, and worked them like animals. His method was systematic. He would recruit workers in poor Mexican towns, promising $15 per hour and assistance obtaining work permits. He'd provide transportation to the United States. Once workers arrived, he'd confiscate their passports and identification documents. He'd tell them they now owed him $8,000 for transportation and housing. Until they paid off this debt, they'd work for $3 per day. Not per hour per day, for 16 hours, 7 days a week. She paused. The workers were locked in basement rooms at night. They weren't allowed to leave the restaurant premises. If they complained or tried to escape, Mendoza would threaten to have their families in Mexico killed. Several workers who attempted escape were beaten. All were terrified. The courtroom was silent, except for quiet sobbing from the former workers. On March 15, 2024, at approximately 2:47 a.m., a grease fire started in the Casa Mendoza kitchen in Providence. 4 workers were inside preparing food for the next day's service. Fire exits were locked. Mr. Mendoza kept them locked to prevent workers from escaping. The men tried to break down the doors. They screamed for help. But the doors were reinforced steel with deadbolts. They burned to death, trapped inside. Little did anyone know the full extent of Mendoza's operation. Mr. Mendoza, Judge Caprio said, his voice ice. Did you employ undocumented workers? Mendoza stood slowly, his voice a mix of Spanish and English, dripping with false innocence. Your Honor, yo no sabía nada. I didn't know nothing. My managers did this, not me. I run big company, 47 restaurants. I cannot watch everything. Managers hired these people. Managers handled workers. It's not my fault. The question is whether you trafficked and enslaved workers. Enslaved? No. Estos mojados, these wetbacks, they came illegally. I gave them jobs when nobody else would. They should be grateful. $3 per day? Mentira. Lies. I have payroll records showing I paid fair wages. If they say different, they're liars looking for money. Francisco Gutierrez stood suddenly, shaking with rage. You murdered my brother. You locked him in that kitchen. He burned alive because you locked the doors. Fire exits? Mendoza gestured dismissively. Building code, landlord responsibility, not mine. I rent property, landlord maintains building. It's his fault, not mine. Order. Caprio banged his gavel. Mr. Mendoza, sit down. You will not blame landlords for your crimes. As not crime, as business. You Americans don't understand. On Mexico, I started with nothing, worked like dog. Nobody helped me. These men wanted easy money without papers, as their problem, not mine. Judge Caprio's hands gripped the bench. Mr. Mendoza, 4 men died because you locked them in a building. I didn't lock them. Manager locked doors for security. Night shift workers, prevent robbery. That's normal restaurant practice. If Judge Caprio's compassion moves you like it moves millions of others, show your support by subscribing to our channel. We're just starting out, and your subscription means everything. Jennifer Thompson stood again. Your Honor, we have testimony from Francisco Gutierrez. who worked at Casa Mendoza for 18 months before escaping. Mr. Gutierrez. Francisco walked to the witness stand, his voice shaking. Your Honor, in 2022, a recruiter came to my town in Michoacan, Mexico. He said Mr. Mendoza needed workers for his American restaurants. Good pay, $15 per hour. Legal work permits, housing provided. My brother Luis and I signed up. We were desperate. Our town had no jobs. We were taken to a house near the border, then smuggled across in a truck with 30 other men. When we arrived at the Providence restaurant, Mr. Mendoza took our passports. He said we owed him $8,000 each for transportation. Until we paid, we'd work for $3 per day. $3 per day? Caprio asked. Yes, Your Honor. 16-hour shifts, 7 days per week. We slept in the basement. 20 men in one room with mattresses on the floor. No windows, one bathroom. The door was locked from outside at night. We were prisoners. What about the $15 per hour you were promised? Lies, all lies. When I complained, the manager beat me with a metal pipe, broke 2 of my ribs. Mr. Mendoza was there. He watched. He laughed. He said if I complained again, he'd have my mother killed in Mexico. He showed me a photo of my mother's house. He knew where she lived. Tears streamed down Francisco's face. I escaped after 18 months by breaking a basement window. But my brother Luis stayed. He was afraid for our mother. 3 years later, Luis died in that fire. Locked in, screaming, burning. My brother burned to death because Mr. Mendoza locked the doors to keep his slaves inside. Mendoza stood, his face red. Mentiroso. Liar. This man is criminal who stole from my restaurant. He escaped because I was going to call police. Everything he says is lies. Sit down, Mr. Mendoza, Caprio said coldly. No, I will not sit while criminals lie about me. Bailiff, restrain Mr. Mendoza. 2 bailiffs moved toward Mendoza. He jerked away, still shouting, This is persecution, anti-Mexican discrimination. You Americans hate successful Latino businessmen. You want to destroy us. The bailiffs finally forced him into his seat. The courtroom was in chaos. Judge Caprio banged his gavel repeatedly. This court is in recess for 15 minutes. Everyone calm down. When court resumed, Mendoza sat with his arms crossed, glaring at the judge. Caprio's expression was cold fury barely contained. Mr. Mendoza, your outburst is noted. Mr. Gutierrez was testifying about his brother's death. Let him finish. Francisco continued, his voice broken. Your Honor, after I escaped, I called my brother every week. He was terrified. He said the doors were always locked. He said if there was ever a fire, they'd all die. I begged him to escape. He said Mr. Mendoza had shown them videos of what happens to workers who escape. Beatings, families hurt. Luis was too scared. On March 15th at 3 a.m., I got a call from another worker who'd also escaped. He said Casa Mendoza Providence was on fire. He said workers were trapped inside. I drove there immediately. When I arrived, the fire department was already there. The building was engulfed in flames. His voice broke completely. I heard screaming, Your Honor. Men screaming inside. Firefighters couldn't get to them because the fire was too intense. By the time they controlled it enough to enter, Luis and 3 others were dead. Burned. My brother burned to death screaming for help while I stood outside, unable to save him. The courtroom was silent, except for sobbing. What the judge discovered next shocked everyone. Jennifer Thompson held up documents. Your Honor, we obtained internal communications from Casa Mendoza Management. On February 3, 2024, Fire Marshal Robert Chen inspected the Providence location and issued a violation notice for locked fire exits. He wrote, Fire exits must remain unlocked during business hours and when workers are present. Current lock configuration violates fire code and creates deadly hazard. The fire marshal gave Mr. Mendoza 30 days to correct the violation. Mr. Mendoza's response, in an email to his operations manager dated February 8th. Ignore fire marshal. We cannot unlock doors. Workers will escape. Fire marshal will forget about it. If he comes back, we pay fine. Fine is cheaper than losing workers. The courtroom gasped. Mendoza had knowingly maintained deadly conditions to prevent escapes. You chose to keep workers trapped rather than comply with fire safety? Caprio's voice shook. Mendoza stood again. That's not how it sounds. Fire marshal was exaggerating. Locks were for security. Restaurant in bad neighborhood, preventing break-ins. At 2:47 a.m. when no customers are present? Night shift preparation. Still need security. You locked human beings inside a building with no way to escape a fire. That's not locking human beings, as standard restaurant practice. It's slavery. You imprisoned workers. Mendoza's voice rose. You keep using slavery. That's not slavery. They agreed to work. They signed contracts. Contracts in Spanish they couldn't read promising $15 per hour when you paid $3 per day. They came illegally. They had no rights. I gave them opportunity. You gave them death. Jennifer Thompson stood again. Your Honor, we also have testimony from Dr. Sarah Martinez, medical examiner who performed autopsies on the 4 victims. Dr. Martinez? A woman in her 50s stood. Your Honor, I examined the remains of Diego Ramirez, Miguel Santos, Carlos Hernandez, and Luis Gutierrez. All 4 died from thermal burns and smoke inhalation. But what was most disturbing was the evidence of their desperation. The bodies were found piled against the locked fire exit door. They'd tried to break it down. Diego's hands were broken from pounding on the door. Miguel's fingernails were torn off from clawing at the door frame. Carlos and Luis had severe injuries from throwing themselves at the door. They died slowly, over approximately 8 minutes based on fire progression models. 8 minutes of knowing they were trapped. 8 minutes of trying desperately to escape. 8 minutes of burning and suffocating while screaming for help that never came. The courtroom fell silent. Several jurors were crying. Even Mendoza's attorneys looked disturbed. Furthermore, Dr. Martinez continued, when we examined the bodies, we found evidence of long-term malnutrition, untreated injuries, and signs of physical abuse. These men had been living in conditions consistent with slavery. Judge Caprio stood, papers shaking in his hands. Mr. Mendoza, 4 men burned to death trying to escape a locked room. They pounded on doors until their hands broke. They clawed at walls until their fingernails tore off. They screamed for 8 minutes while you, the man who imprisoned them, was sleeping comfortably in your mansion. It's not my fault. I wasn't there. I didn't start fire. You locked the doors. You kept them enslaved. You ignored fire safety violations. You chose profit over human lives. I run business, 47 restaurants. It's impossible to monitor everything. You monitored enough to threaten workers' families in Mexico. You monitored enough to beat escapees. You monitored enough to confiscate passports. But you couldn't monitor fire safety? Mendoza gestured grandly, his voice rising. In Mexico, I started with nothing. My family was poor. Nobody gave me anything. I worked every day, suffered, sacrificed. That's how you build success. These men wanted shortcuts. Come to America illegally, get easy money. As their choice, their consequences. They didn't choose to burn to death. They chose to come illegally. That is root cause. If they stayed in Mexico legally, they'd be alive. If you hadn't trafficked and enslaved them, they'd be alive. I gave them opportunity, Mendoza shouted, slamming his hands on the table. Better opportunity than Mexico. $3 per day is more than they made at home. I provided food, shelter, work. They were better off with me. They're dead. A tragic accident. Kitchen fires happen. Not my fault. You locked them inside. For security. How many times I have to explain? You don't understand restaurant business. You sit in comfortable court judging successful people. You never built nothing. Never struggled. You know nothing about real world. Judge Caprio's voice cut like ice. I know that 4 men burned to death because of your greed. I know that 17 others escaped slavery under your restaurants. I know that you used the word mojados, wetbacks, in my courtroom. I know you have no remorse. Here is my ruling. The courtroom held its breath. Ricardo Mendoza, you are found guilty on all counts. 4 counts of second-degree murder, 1 for each man who died in that fire you trapped them in. Human trafficking, forced labor, false imprisonment, conspiracy to violate federal immigration laws. You are sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. You will serve this sentence in full. Mendoza's face went white. Martinez started objecting, but Caprio's voice cut through. Furthermore, all 47 Casa Mendoza restaurant locations are hereby seized under civil asset forfeiture laws. They will be liquidated and the proceeds distributed to victims. You are ordered to pay $60 million in compensatory damages, divided among the families of the 4 deceased workers and the 17 survivors who escaped your slavery operation. All of your personal assets, your homes, your cars, your bank accounts, are frozen and will be liquidated to pay the judgment. He leaned forward. You stood in this courtroom and called human beings mojados. You blame them for coming to America illegally when you're the one who trafficked them here with false promises. You claimed $3 per day was opportunity when you promised $15 per hour. Diego Ramirez was 24. Miguel Santos was 28. Carlos Hernandez was 31. Luis Gutierrez was 35. They came to America dreaming of better lives. You gave them slavery and death. You locked fire exits to prevent escapes. When the fire marshal warned you it would kill someone, you ignored him because fine is cheaper than losing workers. You valued keeping your slaves more than preventing their deaths. 4 men died screaming, burning, trapped because you couldn't risk them escaping. 8 minutes of agony because you wanted 3 per day labor instead of 15 per hour legal workers. His voice rose. Money can buy 47 restaurants. It can buy Armani suits and gold Rolexes. It can buy lawyers who argue that slavery is opportunity. But it cannot buy your way out of prison when your greed burns 4 men alive. Justice cannot have 2 standards, one for restaurant moguls and one for enslaved workers. These men deserved freedom, fair wages, and safe working conditions. Instead, you gave them chains, starvation wages, and death. The courtroom erupted in applause. Francisco collapsed, sobbing. The 17 survivors held each other, crying with relief. Ricardo Mendoza sat motionless, his empire destroyed, his freedom gone for 35 years. If this story touched your heart, if you believe judges like Frank Caprio represent the best of our justice system, please support our new channel by subscribing and liking this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that justice and compassion can coexist. Comment below with your city. Let's build a community that believes in fairness for all. Ricardo Mendoza is currently serving his 35-year sentence at FCI Fort Dix. All 47 restaurants were sold, totaling $96 million. The families and survivors received their compensation. Diego, Miguel, Carlos, and Luis are gone. Their families used the settlement money to build memorial scholarships for young people in their Mexican hometowns who dream of coming to America, legally, with dignity. The case led to the Casa Mendoza Worker Protection Act, legislation requiring unannounced inspections of restaurants employing immigrants, criminal penalties for confiscating identification documents, and protection for workers who report abuse. The law passed unanimously. Judge Caprio, when asked about the harsh sentence, said simply, "Compassion isn't an exception to justice. It's the purpose. These men trusted promises of opportunity. Ricardo Mendoza gave them slavery and death. 35 years is what that betrayal costs. 4 families will never see their sons, brothers, fathers again. All because one restaurateur couldn't pay fair wages and unlock fire exits. But their story exposed modern slavery hiding in plain sight in American restaurants. It proved that locking fire exits to prevent escapes is murder. It showed that calling enslaved workers wetbacks doesn't make slavery legal. Ricardo Mendoza thought his wealth made him untouchable, thought he could blame victims for dying in his trap, thought success justified slavery. He was wrong. And Diego, Miguel, Carlos, Luis, dreamers, workers, brothers, victims, stand as proof that sometimes justice wins. Sometimes the powerful lose. Sometimes the courtroom really is the great equalizer. Not because they were powerful, but because they mattered. And that was enough.